What did God command of soldiers when they went out to war? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on walking through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, turn to Deuteronomy 23. We're going to be reading from verses 9 to 14. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy 23, beginning at verse 9. When the army goes out against your enemies, then keep yourself from every wicked thing. If there is any man among you who becomes unclean by some occurrence in the night, then he shall go outside the camp. He shall not come inside the camp. But it shall be, when evening comes, that he shall wash with water, and when the sun sets, he may come into the camp. Also you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment. And when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it, and turn and cover your refuse. For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you, and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may see no unclean thing among you, and turn away from you. In our last lesson, we had God's commands as to who would be excluded from the assembly of the Lord. Basically, what this meant was who would be excluded from citizenship rights in Israel. Those who intentionally emasculated themselves, those who had been born of incest or adultery, as well as Moabites and Ammonites, were groups that were fully excluded from the assembly of the Lord, although in cases of foreigners, they could become proselytes, converted to becoming an Israelite. Two groups, though, were only partially excluded from the assembly of the Lord, those being the Edomites and the Egyptians. The reason for partial exclusion was because Edom was closely related to Israel through Jacob's brother Esau, and because Israel had been sojourners in the land of Egypt, they were only partially excluded. Moving on to verses 9 to 14 now, we find instructions laid down for when Israel was to go out to war. While in the wilderness, Israel settled in camps, with the Lord said to be in the midst of the camp, in other words, the tabernacle of meeting. Throughout our studies of Leviticus and Numbers, and even here in Deuteronomy, we've seen that all physical uncleanness needed to be dealt with, usually through ceremonial washings or specific sacrifices that needed to be offered. If Israel didn't perform these rituals, then they would be unclean, and if they approached the Lord as unclean, they would be punished. They would soon be entering Canaan and dwelling in towns, not in camps. These rules about clean and unclean would still apply, but not in the same way, as Israel wouldn't all be gathered together with the Lord in their midst. Instead, they would observe these rules within their towns and cities in order that the land did not become defiled. When Israel went out to war, though, the men would again be dwelling in camps, and they needed to be reminded that just because they were out at war didn't mean that the rules concerning clean and unclean were somehow relaxed. It can become commonplace when men of war let their morality go in the heat of battle and commit rape and fornication and adultery with the women of the land that they had conquered. They might eat of things that they weren't supposed to eat of, part of the spoils of war. Whatever evil thought came into their heart, they were not to engage in such, but were to keep themselves from every wicked thing. Now perhaps someone didn't sin, but did become unclean under the law, perhaps by some occurrence in the night. You can see Leviticus 15:16 for that. What were they supposed to do then? The person would go outside the camp during the day, and then when evening came, they were to wash themselves with water, and then they may come into the camp. Physical uncleanness needed to be cleansed, and the Lord set out a process for that under the old law. In verses 12 and 13, Moses then returns to another form of uncleanness, that of refuse. People in the 21st century take for granted that we have toilets with which to remove all of our bodily waste. But such didn't exist then, and when Israel was camped in between battles, such bodily waste needed to be dealt with. In order to do so, Israel was to dig a hole in the ground, bury the refuse in it, and then cover the refuse again. So what we have described here is basically human waste composting. In getting Israel to do this, not only was God dealing with the physical uncleanness under the law, but he was also promoting good sanitary conditions, as if refuse was present everywhere in the open field, then disease could have spread much easier, thus harming Israel's army. But just like we've said in the past, even though we can find sanitary reasons for God's instructions here, the overriding reason for these instructions was found in verse 14, which was that the Lord was walking in the midst of the camp to deliver them from their enemies. So any physical uncleanness under the law needed to be removed. Remember, the law of Moses was a physical law where ceremonial physical uncleanliness was important. Today we're not under the law of Moses. We're under the spiritual law of Christ. So these rituals here are not required in order to be obedient to God. However, that doesn't mean that we can walk around spiritually unclean with sin. That needs to be dealt with by becoming a Christian through a working faith in God that obeys, and then afterwards by seeking God's forgiveness when we sin. If we do this, God will be pleased and we will be saved. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 15 to 25, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.